ich groll nicht, und wenn das Herz auch bricht, ewig verlorenes Lied.
The Condition of the Working Class in England is an 1845 book by the German philosopher Friedrich Engels, a study of industrial working class in Victorian England. Engels' book was originally written in German. An English translation was published in 1887. It was written during Engels' 1842 to 44 stay in Manchester, where his family owned a mill. He worked in Weaste, Salford, in the offices of Ermen Engels' Victoria Mill, which made sewing threads. Ermen was a Dutch partner of the Engels family. Apparently the mill was noted for its fine quality threads. And Manchester was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, and compiled by Engels' own observations and detailed contemporary reports, also working in Chetham's library, at times with Karl Marx. Engels met Mary Burns, a young Irish woman with radical opinions, who worked in the Engels factory, allegedly. They began a relationship that lasted 20 years until her death in 1863. Burns guided Engels through Manchester and Salford, showing him the worst districts for his research. After this second meeting in 1844, Karl Marx read and was profoundly impressed by the book. I first read this book, I'm not certain if it was at school or university, and what fascinated me with it was that each city he considered, he expressed his shock at the terrible conditions in which the working class lived. He not only wrote about English cities, but included Dublin, Edinburgh and Glasgow, each city being worse than the last, until he finally came to Manchester, the most horrific of any city he visited. Then when I lived in Manchester, where I spent most of my life, I would refer to the book, tracing out the districts he spoke of. Myself living not far from the streets along Oxford Road, where Engels had generally lived, including 6 Thornycroft Grove, 25 Dover Street and 58 Dover Street. They were close to the German Albert Club and Schindler Anschluss clubs. Manchester possessed a sizable number of foreign merchants who gravitated around the cotton trade, including Germans, Italians, Egyptians, as well as numerous Jewish migrants who arrived from Central and Eastern Europe. Although he also lived at 70 Great Juicy Street, where the Boddington's Brewery used to be, and 51 to 69 Cecil Street, in what was then affluent Moss Side. Apparently he moved regularly to avoid the Prussian Secret Service. The thatched house was demolished in 1872 as the Arndale was built. This is where Engels would meet on Saturdays with fellow Germans, such as scientists Karl Schorlenger, Heinrich Caro, Ludwig Mond, and indeed Karl Marx. Engels was deeply influenced by his first stay in Manchester. The social and political struggles taking place impressed him. Manchester was the focal point of the Chartist movement, the developing trade unions and cooperative societies, as it was for the factory agitations such as the campaign to end child labour and to introduce a 10-hour bill. He noted how politically active and well-read a great number of Manchester working class were. A 12-foot statue of Friedrich Engels is currently located at Tony Wilson Place in Manchester. First constructed in the 1970s, the statue was originally in the village of Mala Pesherachepna in the Poltava Oblast of the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic. In 2015, Ukraine passed a series of laws that outlawed the public display of Soviet symbols, and the statue was consequently removed from its original position and discarded in a field, having been cut in half at the waist. On this platform, I've come across a vlog titled complaining about the statue on the grounds that Engels advocated genocide. Oh, really? But this vlog actually suggested that Al-Quran is an example of hate crime. Engels clearly identifies the condition of the working class in Manchester as being caused by industrial capitalism. In particular, he identifies how capital investment and urban populations were used to undermine the living conditions of workers. Issues which I discuss in my vlogs on industry, and in particular the woolen industry in Shropshire and Mid Wales. By Manchester, he's referring to the cotton towns of South Lancashire and North East Cheshire, and noting that in these towns, Bolton, Preston, Wigan, Bury, Rochdale, Middleton, Heywood, Oldham, Ashton, Stalybridge, Stockport, the division of labour is even more extreme than in the city itself, suggesting that Bolton, Oldham and Preston to be amongst the most deprived. Somewhat amazing, and despite successive regenerations, the same could be said today, although I might exchange Rochdale for Preston. In a cotton industry of South Lancashire, the application of the forces of nature, the superseding of hand labour by machinery, especially by the power loom, and the self-acting mule, and the division of labour are seen as the highest point. And if we recognise in these three elements that which is the characteristic of modern manufacture, we must confess that the cotton industry has remained in advance of all branches of industry, from the beginning down to the present day. The effects of modern manufacture upon the working class must necessarily develop here more freely and perfectly, and the manufacturing proletariat present itself in its fullest classical perfection. The degradation to which the application of steam power, machinery and division of labour reduce the working man, and attempts of the proletariat to rise above this abasement must likewise be carried to the highest point, and with the fullest consequences. At the time of writing, even what we now call central Manchester was viewed with horror by Engels. One main street, a very dirty one, Deansgate, which serves as a market, and is even in the finest weather a dark, unattractive hall, in spite of the fact that, except for the factories, its sides are formed by low one-storied houses. Here, as everywhere, the older part of the town is especially ruinous and miserable. A dark-coloured body of water which leaves the beholder in doubt whether it's a brook or a long string of stagnant puddles flows through the town and contributes its share to the total pollution of the air, by no means pure without it. The Engels company had an office just off Deansgate, where Kendall's car park is today. Paradoxically, Deansgate went on to become one of Manchester's main and most prestigious shopping streets. But in general, Engels commented on the division of Manchester's working class areas from its commercial heart. The town itself is peculiarly built so that a person may live in it for years and go in and out daily without coming into contact with a working people's quarter, or even with workers. That is, so long as he confines himself to his business or to pleasure walks. This arises chiefly from the fact that by unconscious tacit agreement, as well as with unspoken conscious determination, the working people's quarters are sharply separated from the sections of the city reserved for the middle class, or if it does not succeed, they are concealed with the cloak of charity. Manchester contains at its heart a rather extended commercial district, perhaps half a mile long, and about as broad, and consisting almost wholly of offices and warehouses. Close to the centre, he identifies Todd Street, Long Millgate, Withy Grove and Shude Hill as having dirty old and tumbled down, and the construction of the sides of the streets utterly horrible. Close by what is now the Co-op headquarters, he wrote, Right and left, a multitude of covered passages lead from the main street into numerous courts, and he who turns in thither gets a filth and disgusting grime, the equal of which is not to be found, especially in the courts which lead down to the Irk, and which contain unqualifiably the most horrible dwellings which I have yet beheld. In one of these courts there stands directly at the entrance, at the end of a covered passage, a privy without a door, so dirty that inhabitants can pass into and out of the court only by passing through foul pools of stagnant urine and excrement. An area which in the 1950s and 1960s had a reputation for hedonistic nightlife, resembling Hamburg. Privies are so rare that they either fill up every day or are too remote for most inhabitants to use. How can people wash when they have only the dirty Irk water at hand, while pumps and water pipes can be found in decent parts of the city alone? In truth, it cannot be charged to the account that these helots of modern society, if their dwellings are not more cleanly than the pigsties, which are here and there to be seen amongst them. Close by this area is now known as Red Bank, which Engels described as utterly uninhabitable, and amongst Manchester's most notorious slums. Red Bank was largely a Jewish settlement. North was Irish Town, not to be confused with the equally deprived little island behind Oxford Road Station, where he wrote, "If the totally planless construction is injurious to the health of the workers, by preventing ventilation, this method of shutting up in courts surrounded on all sides by building is far more so. The air simply cannot escape. The chimneys of the houses are the sole drains for the imprisoned atmosphere of the courts, and many serve the purpose only so long as a fire is kept burning. Moreover, the houses surrounding such courts are usually built back to back, having a rear wall in common, and this alone suffices to prevent any sufficient through ventilation. And the police charged with the care of the street does not trouble itself about the condition of these courts, as everything quietly lies where it is thrown. There is no cause for wonder at the filth and heaps of ashes and offal to be found here." Irish Town is around what is known as Angel Meadows and the Green Quarter. Angel Meadows was formerly home to a housing area of the same name, which although initially started out as affluent, fell into disrepair and neglect in the overcrowding of the 19th century Industrial Revolution. In the shadow of the world's first cotton mill, 3,000 souls trapped by poverty are fighting for survival. Numerous pawn shops and marine stores, fenced items pickpocketed or robbed by street gangs, and beer shops offered an illegal potato-derived spirit known as poteen. Thieves and prostitutes kept company with rats in overcrowded lodging houses and deep cellars on the banks of the Black River, the Irk. Cholera, typhoid and tuberculosis were endemic, cholera having spread through the city in 1832, having come originally from Sunderland docks. With so many rats, this will have been an inevitable fact of life for people, contributing to the morose mortality rates, many of whom were children. The land adjacent to the church became the largest cemetery in Manchester, used for the mass interment, maybe as many as 40,000. Of those, no family place or burial, or were too poor to afford a proper funeral. As Engels wrote, the resting place of the outcast and the superfluous, partially decayed bodies were heaped up just as it happens. The piles were driven into newly made graves so that the water oozed out of the swampy ground, pregnant and putrefying matter, and filled the neighbourhood with the most revolting and injurious gases. Bodies were disposed of in a large hole. There were no individual ceremonies or headstones to mark the grave. Coffins were piled indifferently on top of one another. In the evening, the pit was covered with planks and locked to determine vermin. The Angel Meadows came into use as a local legend said that angels could be seen near the steps. guarding the graves of the young, likely victims to the abject and dire deprivation. The condition became so awful that in 1855 the graveyard was covered over, and an Act of Parliament was passed following a government-led investigation to the levels of the squalor. This led to the name of the area becoming known as St Michael's Flags. The flags became known for housing prostitutes, street entertainers, cockfights and bare-knuckle brawls, with gathered crowds gambling on the competitions in the second half of the 19th century. Street gangs of adolescent scuttlers fought for control of the neighbouring streets. Ancoats was largely fields until development began in the 1870s. By 1815 it had the most cotton mills and largest number of households of any district in Manchester. It's recognised as the first residential district of the modern world, specifically intended for occupation by the new working class. Engels wrote, southward from Great Ancoats Street lies a great staggering workingman's quarter, a hilly, barren stretch of land occupied by detached, irregularly built rows of houses or squares. Between these empty building lots, uneven clay, without grass and scarcely passable in wet weather. By the second half of the 1880s, there was a considerable Irish population resident in Manchester, primarily as a result of the Great Irish Famine 1845 to 52, which forced hundreds of thousands of people to leave Ireland. The majority of these Irish immigrants came from the west of Ireland, who seemed to live in the worst conditions, even within the Irish communities of Manchester. So popular was Manchester with Irish migrants that by 1871 a quarter of the city's population was Irish. Throughout the UK there was a widespread anti-Irish and anti-Catholic beliefs, which continued well into the 20th century. Manchester was similar, no different in its treatment of Irish people living in the city. The situation intensified in Manchester as Irish-born residents were granted the same access to poor relief as English-born residents. In May 1847 there was 217 applications for relief from Little Ireland, 203 Irish applicants and 14 English. In the 1941 census, Little Ireland had a population of only 1,510, mostly concentrated in the small streets and courts of the main thoroughfares, James Lee Street, William Street, Frank Street, Ford Street and Anvil Street, were over 75% Irish in 1841. The entrance to Little Ireland being the rock pub, the Salisbury. Those who know it will also know how it slopes down to a roop in the Medlock. Indeed, Engels also mentions Little Ireland, immediately southwest of Ox Road, and is known as Little Ireland. It's a rather deep hole in the curve of the Medlock, and surrounded on all sides by tall factories and high embankments, covered with buildings, stand two groups of about 200 cottages, are built chiefly back to back, in which about 400 human beings, most of them Irish. The cottages are dirty and the smallest sort, the streets uneven, fallen into ruts and parts without drains or pavements. Masses of refuse, offal and sickening filth lie amongst standing pools in all directions. The atmosphere is poisoned by the effluvia from these, and laden and darkened by the smoke of a dozen tall factory chimneys. A horde of ragged women and children swarm about here, as filthy as swine that live upon the garbage heaps and in the puddles. In short, the whole rookery furnishes such a hateful and repulsive spectacle, can hardly be equalled in the worst court on the Irk. The race that lives in these ruinous cottages, behind broken windows, medded with oilskin, sprung doors and rotten doorposts, in the dark wet cellars, in measureless filth and stench, In its atmosphere, penned as if with a purpose, this race must really have reached the lowest stage of humanity. The opening of the Oxford Road station in 1849, which cleared a vast area of houses and split Wakefield Road into two. In 1847, the residents of part of Little Island were forcibly ejected from their homes by the railway company. The station was expanded in 1857 and rebuilt in 1874, each taking more and more of the more land from the slums around it. Engels identifies Salford, Hulme, Chorlton-on-Medlock, not to be confused with the now affluent suburb of Chiltern-cum-Hardy, and most of Ardwick as thoroughly working-class districts. With the exception of this commercial district, all of Manchester proper, all Salford and Hulme, a great part of Pendleton and Chorlton, 2/3 of Ardwick, and single stretches of Cheetham Hill and Broughton are all unmixed working people's quarters, stretching like a girdle, averaging 1.5 miles in breadth around the commercial district. Writing on Hulme to the east of Little Island, it's west, isn't it? To the west of Little Island. Here are long, narrow lanes which run contracted, crooked courts and passages, the entrances to which are so irregular that the explorer is caught in a blind alley at every few steps, or comes here as where he least expects to, unless he knows every court and every alley exactly and separately. And of Salford, the average construction of Salford is in many respects much worse than that of Manchester, and so too in many respects to cleanliness. If Manchester, the police from time to time, every 6 to 10 years, make a raid upon a working people's district, closes the worst dwellings and causes the filthiest spots in these or Guian stables to be cleansed, in Salford it seems to have done absolutely nothing. Very few houses were built by the factory owners. The vast majority were erected by third-party property speculators, resulting in unregulated and unplanned urban expansion, with blocks of housing built at differing angles following the alignments only of intervening streets. The lack of regulation led to piecemeal development of streets, mainly back-to-back and blind-back houses, often only a single room, wide and deep, with windows found only on their front walls, without any form of water supply or sanitation. And many of the houses included cellar dwellings, often accessed via staircases from the street level, or in some cases by a trapdoor from the ground level of the building. Back-to-back houses required relatively low material costs, with speculative developments potentially providing high returns, thereby maximising the return on the land. Engels pays a lot of attention to the insanitary conditions in which Manchester's working class lived, especially in Little Island, in particular the sanitary police, whom were charged with the hapless task of preventing cholera outbreaks. Indeed, in 1844, Manchester banned the building of new back-to-back houses. Many houses took in lodgers, often with them sleeping in the same bed of husband and wife, regardless of the gender. Also, cohabiting was common, and often couples would not be officially married. There were also lodging houses where 5 to 7 people would sleep on the floor of each room, meaning that maybe 30 people would sleep in the house. Engels claims that often genders were mixed in these rooms. It is fitting that the working class clothing in Manchester was solely made of cotton, with fustian cotton replacing wool for men's trousers and jackets. Often very similar clothing, the very same clothing was worn every day and was ill suited to changes in the temperature. Engels blames the Irish for having introduced a tradition of being barefoot, which was, at his time, common in Manchester. Maybe synchronicity, but I was only reading yesterday how even today children wander the streets of Blackpool barefoot. Food was often adulterated or unfit for human consumption. He mentions Christmas geese being so foul that they could not be sold in Liverpool and were thus shipped to Manchester, although the staple for the poorest workers was poor quality potatoes. At this time, when people all worked 12 hours a day and more for pittance wages in unsafe, unhealthy conditions, it's no surprise that the combination of long hours and backbreaking labour in insufferable working conditions that caused early mortality in the factories. And most of them are unfit for work at 40 years. A few hold out to 45, almost none to 50 years of age. Indeed, the average life expectancy was just 26 or 17 for the working classes. Workers had no job security and were highly regimented on the job, their every move controlled by the boss. As Engels points out, the work was so sporadic that even the most affluent workers could be plunged into poverty and even starvation.
Ist rolle nicht, und wenn das hört,